Well, good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be here with you, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about the Center for Food Integrity and our work and our focus on building trust and really building public support in an age of radical transparency and unbridled social media. And what are the relationships between values, trust, and science? As the food system, we are very steeped in science and we're very good with science. And it's interesting to take a look at what is the role and relationship that science has to building consumer trust in today's food system. In terms of disclosure, as Joe mentioned, we are a nonprofit organization focused on building consumer trust. We have members from the US and Canada working on finalizing an Australian affiliate. We do not lobby, nor do we speak on behalf of any company or brand. And so we don't do any of that work. We are funded by a diverse group of members. You can find our members at the foodintegrity.org website. We've received funding from more than 100 different organizations over the last couple of years, representing the diversity of the food chain. And as was mentioned, we are managed, the Center for Food Integrity has an independent board of directors, and we manage them through an association management firm that we operate. Most of you who work in the food system, particularly those who work in the private sector, are focused on how do you protect and maintain your organization's freedom to operate. So whether you're focused on food safety, whether you're focused on product development, whatever the particular area of focus happens to be, part of your job is to help protect your organization's freedom to operate. And we're going to build a model that will help us hopefully end up there by the time we're through with the presentation. In today's environment, it really requires us to consistently earn and maintain a social license. And we define a social license as the privilege of operating with minimal formalized restrictions based on maintaining public trust by doing what's right. And that public trust is something that can be increasingly challenging to define and challenging then to manage as well. And today, that social license can be revoked through legislation, regulation, or more frequently what we see now is through market action, where a branded food company, a restaurant, a grocery chain, someone within the food system will receive enough pressure to say that particular product, that ingredient, that process is inconsistent and threatens our freedom to operate, so we're going to make it go away. And we'll talk about the economic consequences of that, but lean, finely textured beef is probably the most recent and most visible illustration of how that happens. And public trust is a belief that our activities are consistent with social expectations, the values of the community, and other stakeholders. And we know from our research there is an inverse relationship between the size of a food company or a food organization and the perception of shared values that fundamentally define trust. So as we become larger, as we become more integrated, as we become more global, that sense of public trust that we're committed to the same values and social expectations of our stakeholders is diminished. And we have the research to support that as well. And I think I can make a fairly compelling argument that maintaining social license is not an act of altruism, it's enlightened self-interest. Because maintaining that social license gives you the opportunity to have a system that's more flexible, responsive, and lower cost. But you're only granted that if the public perception is that you're operating in a way consistent with the ethics, values, and expectations of your stakeholders. And you impose some kind of self-regulatory scheme to maintain that kind of expectation. So we've seen that play out over and over again across the food system, and I'll give you a couple of illustrations, but I'd also like to give you an illustration from outside the food system that can illustrate exactly the power and the consequence of losing that social license. The accounting profession had established their own self-regulatory mechanism. You have the Financial Accounting Standard Board, certified public accountants. The entire system was set up to build and maintain that level of public trust in the accounting profession and how they operated, until we had Arthur Andersen, Enron, and WorldCom. And fundamentally, public trust in the accounting profession was destroyed. And Congress stepped in and passed the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, and now the average cost of complying with Sarbanes-Oxley for a public company is between $10 and $15 million a year. Those are dollars that can't be invested in research. They serve no real public benefit. They don't provide any opportunity for companies to continue to grow or return anything to their shareholder. But it's a direct consequence of losing that social license and losing the public trust. The other key element in this model to remember is that the consequences for losing social license do not accrue exclusively to the bad actor. They accrue to the entire sector. So when the accounting profession lost its social license, it wasn't just Arthur Andersen, it was the entire accounting profession. When lean finely textured beef was taken off the market, it wasn't just one entity that was impacted by that, it was everyone in the food system that suffered as a result. So each of us have a vested interest in how every stakeholder across the food system operates in a way to maintain social license, which is also a somewhat different dynamic than we've had historically, where we focused on maintaining the public trust in our company and in our brand. We now have a greater appreciation that the impact of a loss of social license impacts the entire sector, and that impact continues to grow. And once you cross that tipping point and you move to social control, where it's all about regulation, legislation, litigation, and compliance, it becomes significantly more rigid, more bureaucratic, and higher cost. And we've also never seen an illustration or example of when that has been taken away. So once you go to social control, we've never seen social license reclaimed. We've certainly seen where people have had the ability to mitigate the impact of social control, but we've never seen social license reinstated. Kashi is one of the more recent examples. Some of you may be familiar with that, where one store owner in Rhode Island posted a shelf tag talking about his concern about GM soy in Kashi cereals. Photos of that were captured and went viral, popping up on Facebook pages and food blogs all around the country. Folks were claiming that Kellogg misrepresented its cereal. And the response from Kellogg's was kind of the classic food system response. Kashi has done nothing wrong, according to David D'Souza. The FDA has chosen not to regulate the term natural. The company defines natural as food that is minimally processed, made with no artificial colors, flavors, preservatives, or sweeteners. Now, there's nothing inaccurate about that statement, but in terms of its ability to instill and reinforce social license and public trust, it's not where we need to be. And we'll talk specifically about why that doesn't meet that expectation in just a little bit. We talked already about lean finely textured beef, product that had been in the market for decades. Mommy blogger in Houston picked it up, went viral again, and before long the product was simply taken off the market as the pressure on brands and others became too great for them to continue to support its use, even though it was perfectly safe, it was truly sustainable in terms of making maximum use of the resources that were available, and despite all of that, because of the social media storm, the product was taken off the market. The egg recall in the summer of 2010, more than 500 million eggs recalled as a result of the concern over Salmonella enteritidis, 2 recalls, an aggressive FDA inquiry on the farms. Recall expanded to include other farms that bought eggs from the farm that was involved in the recall directly, but it expanded beyond just that particular farm. As we saw the concern of FDA expand to others, it was one of the many catalysts in passage of the Food Safety Modernization Act, saw increased enforcement of the federal food safety rule. The nation's 600 largest egg farms now were all subject to additional investigation and inspection because of what took place on the one farm. Again, an illustration that the consequences of a bad actor do not accrue only to the bad actor. They accrue to the entire sector. And so again, reinforcing that each of us has an interest in how everyone in the system operates. So that social license, as I said, is based on maintaining public trust. And historically, we've sometimes confused the concepts of image and trust. They're not the same concept. They are fundamentally different. And we've done some significant investigation and research into what it takes to actually build trust in food. We began with a meta-analysis, partnering with Steve Sapp at Iowa State University, looking at 21 different pieces of research to see if we could identify some common drivers in building trust in food. And we identified the 3 common drivers you see there on the left-hand side of the screen in each of those 21 pieces of research. On the left-hand side at the bottom, influential others. That includes your social circle, your family and friends, and credentialed individuals whose opinions you respect, dietitians, doctors, etc. The second element in building trust is competence. That's our technical capacity, our skills, research, and science. And historically, that's where we've spent most of our time talking about who we are and what we do in the food system. If we have the right information, if we have the right data, if we can prove the claims that we're making, clearly people will be rational and they will come to our side of the argument. And if they aren't coming to our side of the argument, then what it must indicate is we don't have the right science. So we need to do more research. We need to go get additional data, because if we give people the right data, they'll clearly come to our side of the argument. And that's been the model that we've operated under across the food system. The third element in building trust is confidence, or the perception of shared values and ethics. In other words, can I count on you to do what's right? So we surveyed 6,000 consumers across the U.S. over the course of 3 years on issues related to food safety, nutrition, worker care, animal well-being, sustainability, a whole range of different issues. And what we discovered in that was that the perception of shared values is 3 to 5 times more important in building trust than demonstrating our competency. So we've had the historical public communication model about who we are and what we do exactly backward, because people are more concerned about whether or not we share their values than whether we have the ability to prove the claim that we're making with additional data. They're looking for enough information to have permission to believe that what we're doing is consistent with their values and expectations. So in terms of changing how we think about engaging, it's significantly more about finding that shared value and that opportunity to engage than it is about simply proving the data and proving the claims that we make. So it's the old Roosevelt quote, what it means, they really don't care how much we know until they know how much we care. So I want to change focus here just a bit and talk a little bit more about values and ethics in our science-based culture. And when I talk about the science-based culture, I really am referring to the culture of the food system. Lawrence Kohlberg was a brilliant social psychologist who did a lot of his work at the University of Chicago in the 1960s. Spent his entire career studying ethical decision-making, looking at how people make decisions when they're faced with an ethical or moral dilemma. And by giving the Heinz dilemma to thousands of people all over the world, he developed his moral hierarchy, which has 3 levels and 6 stages. And I want to use that as an illustration to hopefully enlighten and talk a little bit about how sometimes we unintentionally undermine our own credibility simply by how we talk about who we are and what we do. So the pre-conventional direct impact on me, first level is punishment and obedience. I'm going to clean my room because if I don't, Mom's going to be mad at me. Second, personal rewards orientation. I'm going to base all of my decisions based on what's in it for me. That's going to guide my behavior and my conduct. Conventional societal expectations, the good boy, nice girl orientation, what will people think about me or say about me based on what I do. Law and order orientation, I will be in compliance. Post-conventional principle-driven social contract, what's in the best interest of the group. And then finally, a commitment to universal ethical principles, things like compassion, responsibility, respect, fairness, and truth. Now, have we ever said, well, we focus on food safety and efficiency because it's important to the bottom line? So what that implies is if something else is more important for the bottom line, we'll focus on that instead. That's the implied message, because what drives our behavior, what drives our decision making is what's most important for the bottom line. Or we say, look, we're in compliance with all food safety, environmental, and employment laws and regulations. Compliance should be sufficient. That was essentially the Kashi response. We've done nothing wrong. We're in compliance. This is consistent with the FDA's definition. Or are we willing to say that we have an ethical obligation to produce safe food responsibly, to respect our employees, the environment, our customers, and our communities, and here's how we operate every single day to live up to that obligation. Here's the best part about this model. If you work for a company that's committed to doing the right things for the right reasons, it costs you nothing to move from the bottom of Kohlberg's moral hierarchy to the very top. It's a change in mindset, it's a change in how we think, and it's a change in how we communicate. So we claim the ethical high ground that belongs to companies and organizations that are committed to doing the right things for the right reasons. So rather than simply providing additional data, we help people understand that we share their values. We understand their concern about safe food produced responsibly, and it's something we take seriously. And here's how we actually go about making that happen every single day in our operations. The other thing that's important to recognize is that NGOs, non-governmental organizations, because the perception is they're committed to something other than self-interest, have inherent public credibility. And business, because there is an inherent profit motivation, has a credibility discount when we come to a public conversation about our issues. So we have an obligation, we have a burden we have to overcome in demonstrating our commitment to those same kind of shared ethical principles and values if we want to compete in the same space for credibility and trust with organizations who are perceived to have a public interest where we are perceived to have a private interest. And the only way to overcome that is to recognize that deficit and make sure we have practices in place and a communication strategy that allows us to effectively demonstrate and communicate that commitment to those kinds of principles. So when we talk about a sustainable balance at the Center for Food Integrity, we use a triangle as the illustration for that because of its great structural integrity. And the foundation of that is making sure that our practices are in fact ethically grounded, that we can communicate our commitment to things like compassion, responsibility, respect, fairness, and truth. The second side is about scientific verification. We can't abandon science, and we shouldn't abandon science. You need good science to prove the claims that we're making. You need good science to continue to advance and improve. But it can't play the lead role in our public communication to build trust. And the third side of the triangle is about being economically viable, because at the end of the day, if you're not economically viable, you're not truly sustainable. But here again is where we've gotten the conversation confused. Most of the questions that we get today tend to be at the base of the triangle. Should you use biotechnology? Should you use these types of food production processes? Should you use these processing technologies? Should you use these additives? Should you use these types of chemicals? And our historical response has been, well, science says we can. Can and should aren't the same question. One is a question about ethical justification, the other is about scientific verification. And we've been guilty of trying to substitute scientific verification for ethical justification. Entirely different concepts. Now, we've got great reasons, we've got great ethical reasons for doing what we're doing in terms of making food safer, making it more responsible, making it better for the environment than it's ever been before. But that's about communicating our ethics and communicating our values, not just giving people the data. Because we can't answer a should question with more data. We have to be able to communicate that commitment, and we can't substitute scientific verification for ethical justification. Science tells us if we can, but society tells us whether or not we should. And if they feel strongly enough that we shouldn't, then they'll revoke that social license and tell us we can't. And that's how we've seen the model play out time and time again. When we give people information about science and economics, we increase their knowledge, but we may do nothing to change how they feel or what they believe. And people are more likely to act on how they feel and what they believe than on just what they know. So it's finding that balance, leading with those values, helping people understand our commitment to doing what's right, and then supporting that with additional science and information. As Einstein said, when we think about knowledge versus feelings, the intuitive mind is a sacred gift, the rational mind a faithful servant. We've created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift. And particularly in scientific circles, we've been guilty of that from time to time, when we focus more on the data and less on how people begin to interpret that data, and more importantly, what it means to them individually, because that's what's more likely to drive their decisions. We also very much believe, and I'm sure each of you in this room would agree, that transparency today is really no longer optional. Someone is watching everything you do all the time. Every keystroke, every phone call, everything you do is being captured by someone all the time. And we need to take that into account as we think about how we're going to operate. Occasionally we will run into those across the food system whose risk management strategy is, I hope no one finds out. Not a great strategy. Not a great strategy for managing your risk. Social media explosion, roughly 2 billion people today are connected to the internet. By 2015, 80% of the global population will have a personal mobile device that can be both a receiver and a transmitter. We send 2.9 million emails every second, 20 hours of video uploaded to YouTube every minute, 50 million tweets a day. My two daughters in their 20s are responsible for about 10 million of those, I'm sure. 700 billion minutes on Facebook every month. If Facebook were a country, I'm sure many of you have seen this, it would be the third largest on the planet, behind China and India. Social media now accounts for nearly 25% of time spent online. So we really do have to recognize that transparency really is no longer optional, because today everyone with a cell phone is a cinematographer. One shelf tag in one store in Rhode Island is what launched everything that Kashi dealt with. One shelf tag, one store in Rhode Island. That's all it took for somebody to capture that with a smartphone, and it went viral. So that really is the context in which we need to think about how we're going to manage these challenging issues, because anyone who has an interest in who you are and what you do, whether employees, consumers, customers, or others, can now influence the public conversation at the speed of Twitter. So the question to consider really no longer is, will you be transparent, but how are you going to manage your reputation in an age of radical transparency? That's the fundamental question that all of our organizations are now struggling with and trying to figure out how do we do that? What's the right strategy and what are the right mechanisms for us to think about how we make that happen? Because in today's integrated system, there really is this very tight relationship between those who are involved in production and processing, the brands who are selling the products, and the NGOs who influence that dynamic. And so when an issue arises, those become complex relationships that we may be skilled at managing in some areas and not as skilled in others. But when you add the new dynamic of social media and the speed and pressure that social media bring to these issues, this is a brand new space that many of us are still struggling to define and better understand and develop skills and infrastructure to manage effectively. Because how do we become embedded in these online communities in a place where we are viewed as trusted sources, as trusted members of these communities? Because today, too frequently, we're parachuting in after a crisis and trying to mitigate and do damage control. Not an effective way to manage in today's new highly interactive environment. So navigating volatility, there's heightened public interest today in food, growing mistrust of big food, and our ongoing research that we do every single year indicates that. Again, as I mentioned before, there's an inverse relationship between the size of an organization and the perception of shared values. It's part of what is driving the locavore movement, is that desire to make a connection with someone or something that shares my values, and geography plays a role in the perception of shared values. Increased NGO engagement across the food system, the explosion in social media and empowered consumers. Brands are understandably sensitive to sales and brand equity. We see online petitions, undercover video, and a range of other tools being used to drive change in the food system. So as Darwin said, it's not the strongest nor the smartest who survive, but those who are most responsive to change. So this is a brand new environment that we're dealing with, brand new. We've never seen anything like this before. So what are we going to change? What are we going to do differently in the food system to determine how we're going to be successful long term? This is a generational challenge. This is not going to be resolved with a single campaign, a PR effort, or a marketing initiative. This is a generational challenge that will require us to think differently, act differently, and communicate differently about who we are and what we do in food. Had the pleasure of being on a program with Ray Kohlberg from the Harvard Agribusiness Program a couple of years ago. Not surprisingly, he continues to be out in front. But he had a quote that I thought was particularly insightful at that program. There's a thin line between public, private, and NGO management of the food system. Consolidation creates huge opportunity, but also huge responsibility. We need to create managers where and how the public, private, and NGO communities work together to manage the food system. Are we developing those managers? Do you have those managers in your organization? And how do we do a better job of equipping managers to be effective in that dynamic new environment? Because it is a brand new game. It's a very brand new game. When we used to think about looking at athletics, we think about one team on offense and one team on defense. You'd have to be prepared to play one or the other. So we could think about being proactive or reactive. Both of those are fine, but today we also have to be consistently interactive. So it's no longer enough to be either proactive or reactive. We have to be consistently interactive in that environment. We have to be ready to switch from playing offense to playing defense if we're out there on the court, recognizing that the people watching aren't just the officials, the referees on the court, the regulatory agencies, or the lawmakers, or those at the scorer's table, but it's everyone in the stands. It's everyone who is watching on high def at home in slow-mo, who can see not only what happens on the court, but what happens on the bench and what happens everywhere else that's within sight. That's the environment in which we operate today. Transparency is no longer optional, and we have to be prepared to engage and engage consistently in a way that builds trust in who we are and what we do. And we need to encourage all of our stakeholders to look at the challenges we face in a more holistic way, to understand the interrelationship of all of these different issues and the challenges we have if we focus too much on one particular sector without considering potential unintended consequences to other areas of a truly holistic food supply system. So when we look at building that trust, it really goes back to the initial model we talked about before, where you have influential others, competence, and confidence. It starts again on the left-hand side. Have you taken the time to articulate your values, your ethics? What do you stand for? What can people count on from you and your company? Have you identified those stakeholders who can control your social license, who can limit your freedom to operate? Are they dogmatic? Are they pragmatic? Are they reformers? Are they abolitionists? Who can you engage with, and how do you engage with them successfully over time to build those trustworthy relationships that allow you to continue to have the social license and freedom to operate? And the area where we've historically been strongest is demonstrating that external manifestation, having the best practices, certification, and continuing education, and proving our competency. But it's critically important to recognize and remember that demonstrating our competency and building confidence are entirely different concepts. And we have to be able to do both. And if demonstrating confidence, building confidence, is 3 to 5 times more important than demonstrating competency and building trust, that's a skill set we need to continue to develop and improve. So with that, I'd like to end my formal remarks. I would encourage and look forward to your questions. Feel free to challenge the assumptions. Feel free to challenge my thought process. Look forward to the dialogue, and again, appreciate very much the opportunity to be here.